Flame of Life by Frank Belknap Long. 53,000 miles above the surface of the earth, Thomas Marshall had felt almost godlike. But now he was a shy young man, taking a shower in an airport locker room. He stood in the buff while the torrent descended on him, seeing again the sun glowing in the black heavens, a dull red disk with the visible corona, and all about it white stars glowing. He had come back alive, the first human being to be exposed to cosmic rays at that height, and he was a popular hero. Even Radio Moscow expressed congratulations, but Marshall didn't feel heroic. He was just the kind of man who could do this sort of thing, the solitary sort, the shy type, the lonely kind. They'd given him leave for a few days. They'd arranged for him to get to New York quietly, a police escort whisking him away from the crowd that surrounded the plane, and sneaking him into the airport lockers. He'd have to make some public appearances, he knew, but tonight, at least, he'd be by himself. Which was worse, he wondered, the crowds or the loneliness? He stepped away from the shower and toweled himself dry. He dressed quickly, pulled the hat down over his eyes, loosened the knot of his tie, and lit a cigarette. He paced impatiently about the locker room, cursing softly under his breath. A minute ticked away into a steam-vaporish eternity. Then the door opened, and an airport official peered into the room. "Your car is waiting, Mr. Marshall," he said. "It's a limousine with drawn blinds. A state trooper will accompany you." Thomas Marshall groaned. "The blinds are okay," he said, "but I don't want a police escort." He had his way. 5 minutes later, he left the airport in a long black car that purred, but with no motorcycles trailing him. Being a somebody had its advantages. His slightest whim was satisfied. The car picked up speed as it left the airport. It was soon an ebon cylinder flashing through the night. A wide, macadamized state highway stretched between the airport and the city. It bisected a long stretch of level marshland, ascended in a gradient over meadows that shone with a blue luster in the light of a spectral moon, tunneled under viaducts that quivered with the passing of ponderous trucks, and entered the city through a region of docks and abysmal slums. The change occurred gradually. It began when he left the airport, making him shift about restlessly in the depths of the car. He was shivering violently when the damp marsh air assailed his nostrils. When he passed between the blue-lit meadows, he stared excitedly out of the window. When the dismal dwellings of the waterfront region loomed up on all sides of him, he seized the communication tube and shouted to the driver, "Stop here! Stop at once!" The driver swerved to the curb and stepped on the brakes. There was a squealing of tires as the car came to an abrupt halt beneath the red brick facade of an enormous deserted warehouse. With incredible agility, Marshall leapt from the limousine. He stood for a moment teetering on the curb, his eyes shining, his breath coming fast. The edifice that towered up behind him contrasted strangely with the streamlined magnificence of the limousine. Broken and blankly staring windows gave the warehouse an air of desolation and squalor, which was accentuated by the weather-eroded bricks of its precipitous facade. Utterly cliff-like, it seemed, a cyclopean stone barrier blotting out the stars. Beneath it swarmed the furtive, ugly nightlife of the slums. The driver leaned out of the car and stared at Marshall on the curb. His eyes widened, his mouth fell open. Utter terror shone for an instant in his gaze. Marshall said, "I'll walk the rest of the way, Collier. You can drive the car back to the airport if you wish." The driver cried, "Good God, sir, the light!" "The light? What light? Are you crazy, Collier?" The driver nodded. "I must be. You seem to be all—" "Never mind, Collier. Just leave me." The driver said, "You bet I will." The car swerved out into the center of the street and shot away into the night. Marshall threw his arms up over his head. He waltzed about on his toes. He shouted. He laughed. A savage exultation had him in thrall. A reeling drunk emerged from a dark alley near at hand. He swayed toward Marshall, cursing. Then suddenly he stopped, stared. His eyes got too big for his face. Thomas Marshall began to run. He ran swiftly along the narrow pavement, keeping close to the warehouse. He ran exultantly through the sordid slum. He encircled a lamppost and brushed swiftly past an old woman who stared. He tripped over an alley cat and went sprawling. The cat screeched, erected its tail, and backed away, saliva drooling from its bared teeth. Laughing, Marshall picked himself up. He brushed himself off and started talking to himself. It's just nerves, I guess. The long strain, 10 hours of strain. But it's incredible how light-headed I feel. I could hug and kiss that old woman, and she's as ugly as sin. The old woman was backed against the warehouse, her scrawny hands clutching at her throat. She was staring at him and shaking. All the blood had drained from her face. A shabby shawl dangled from her bony, emaciated shoulders. Her skirt was torn and mud-bedraggled. She was so old she seemed ageless, and incredibly ugly, a fragile, desiccated shell. Marshall murmured, "It's incredible. She didn't seem as old as that a moment ago. She didn't seem—" Suddenly he felt the muscles tightening along his jaw. The old woman was shrinking before his eyes. The flesh of her face was shriveling, darkening. Her clutching, bony hands became destitute of flesh. Her eyes burned like tapers of flame in the depths of her skull-like face. And then, suddenly, her face was a skull. A fleshless skull surmounting a skeleton body against the blood-hued bricks of the warehouse. A cold chill itched across Marshall's scalp. He wiped a hand across his brow and staggered back into the gutter. The skeleton image did not pursue him. It began to dwindle and dissolve. It became a nebulous white blur in the wan light of the street lamps, a vaguely articulated shadow shape that hovered for an instant upright in the gloom. The next instant, it was gone. Between Marshall and the warehouse stretched merely the narrow pavement and the small, elusive shadows of the night. He stood for a moment giddily swaying in the gutter, feeling a constriction about his throat, his tongue parching as he strove desperately to summon reason to his aid. It was an illusion, of course, an illusion of sense. From vague shadows he had conjured up a fantastic shape that resembled a shriveled old woman. Seemingly, it had the same reality as the bricks of the warehouse and the cat which had tripped him, but a strong illusion. Perhaps it was more than an illusion, an actual hallucination, perhaps. He had read somewhere that hallucinations could occur in all the senses simultaneously. Such images were more real than reality. They had a terrible clarity. They burned themselves into the senses in filaments of flame. What was he muttering to himself? He was behaving like an idiot. He drew himself up. He stepped back onto the pavement, squared his shoulders. He was beginning to feel light-headed again. His terror was dwindling. He felt a giddiness sweeping over him, a reckless defiance which banished fear. He began to walk. Presently he was running again. He was nearly at the end of the block when a flash of sudden light leapt out at him, half blinding him. He whirled about in sudden dismay. Confronting him was a shimmering oblong of glass that blazed with little weaving coruscations of light. The window was unbroken. It was low down, on a level with his chest, and not more than 8 feet from the northern extremity of the warehouse. It was one of the few unbroken windows in the great cliff-like building. For an instant he stood rigid and appalled, staring. Mirrored in the tall window was the image of a man, the image of himself. Spirals of white and saffron flame streamed from his head and shoulders, aureoling him in a blinding incandescence. He was literally blanketed in flames that danced and swirled continuously about the upper portion of his body. He could not see his limbs in the glass. Tremulously, He raised his hands and looked at them. They were faintly luminous, but not ablaze. Utter consternation engulfed him. In blind terror, he turned from the window and tottered along the street. Twice he stumbled and nearly fell. He was afire! Yet he felt no pain, no searing torment, as he reeled drunkenly through the night. How he reached the wharf he never knew. There were intervals of terror and confusion when he was obscurely aware of his surroundings, alternated with the blackness that blotted out the world. He seemed at times to be running, at times to be staggering in circles through the shadow-thronged murk. He had a vague recollection of cries of fright, of scurrying human shapes. His faculties were confused for a long while. It was not until he found himself on the wharf that his mind became lucid again, and reality assumed sharp and agonizing contours. He found himself standing on the wharf, gazing down at a gleaming black expanse that mirrored all the stars of heaven. He could hear the murmur of the tides as they swirled and eddied about the rotting pierheads and sucked at barnacle-encrusted piles. An odor of brine assailed his nostrils. Far out over the water, a tugboat shrilled. Slowly, he raised his hands and stared at them. They were still faintly luminous, nebulously aglow. He leaned out over the wharf and gazed down into the dark water. In the depths of the water, he saw human shoulders that blazed, a human head aureoled in flame. Despair enveloped him like a shroud. The girl was standing a few feet away on the opposite side of the wharf. Her head was lowered in somber contemplation of the dark water. Her back was turned to him. She seemed unaware of his presence. Her face was deathly pale in the moonlight. It was a very lovely face. The girl was of medium height, with fair, exquisite features. The moonlight haloed her red-gold hair, dappled her white throat, descended in silver curlicues over her slender body. She was staring intently at the black water, her body swaying a little. Suddenly she moved to the edge of the wharf, cried out in despair, and raised her arms. The next instant she was gone. Marshall stared, thunderstruck. The water below whirled dizzily to his gaze. The star reflections were shattered as though some cosmic hammer had shattered the mirror of the sea. Sweat started out over Marshall's face. His horror forgotten, he bent swiftly. With feverish fingers, he unlaced and removed his shoes, ripped off his coat. As he dived from the wharf, the girl's thrashing body seemed to spin through an ebon vortex immediately beneath him. Straight into the vortex he plunged, his body bent like a bow. He went down into cold blackness, his body sliced through the water in a perfect arc, and emerged 20 feet from the wharf. Frantically, he trod water, turning swiftly about and searching the gleaming expanse for the girl's struggling form. Presently he saw her. She was bobbing about under the wharf, her face obscurely visible in a swirl of foam. Swiftly he swam toward her. Their bodies collided in a churning maelstrom. He turned on his back, grasped her about the waist, and drew her relentlessly to his side. She struggled a little as he swam backward with powerful leg strokes. In a moment he had reached the sloping stone underpinnings of the wharf. He pulled himself to safety with his free arm, dragging the girl up beside him. He stared at her apprehensively as she sagged on a horizontal ledge of stone, her back resting against a huge circular pierhead. Her hair was a sodden mass, her face utterly bloodless. She was choking and gasping for breath. Presently her breathing shortened into sighs. She shifted about on the slippery stone ledge, raised her eyes, and stared at him. Her white face seemed to go a shade whiter. She raised her hands to her throat in terror. Marshall said, "Do not be afraid. The radiance is just fluorescence. I am a chemical worker in a laboratory. Radiant particles lodged in my skin. It will wear off in a little while." He lied feverishly, hoping, praying that she would believe him. He needed someone to cling to in his despair, someone warm and human and alive. The terror went out of her eyes. She slumped on the ledge, her shoulders drooping, her lips twisting. "Forgive me," she said. "The radiance frightened me. For a moment I thought—" Marshall laughed hoarsely. "You thought me Lucifer in shining raiment, perhaps." A wan smile crossed the girl's face. "Why not an angel of light? You risked your life to save me. Only I wanted to die." He was studying the girl closely now. Her clothes were pathetically shabby. She was wearing cotton socks and shoes with plugged soles. Compassion shone in his gaze. Poverty. The girl nodded. "It nearly always is, isn't it?" "Yes," he said, "nearly always. You look half-starved. How long since you've had a decent meal?" The girl said, 3 days. "And how long since you've had a job?" She smiled again. 4 months. I guess I'm not very brave." "Nonsense," he said. "I can tell by your eyes that you are brave, and much too young to die." She said again, "I wanted to die." "I know, but you'll feel better when you've had something to eat." She was looking at him queerly now. Suddenly she said, "You're Thomas Marshall, aren't you?" Momentarily he had forgotten that he was Thomas Marshall. The girl's loveliness had absorbed him to the exclusion of all else. Her recognition dismayed him. He said falteringly, "Yes, I'm Marshall, but I know what it means to be wretched and lonely and lost." The girl stared at him incredulously. "Why should you be lonely? You have everything, wealth, fame." He smiled bitterly. "I'll tell you about it when you're warm again. We'll find a restaurant and talk. You're shivering." They found an all-night cafeteria located on a dingy, winding waterfront street. It was a welcome haven after their strenuous ascent in the cold darkness to the wharf. Compared to the wind that pursued them as they fled to cover, it seemed very warm and friendly. The proprietor was a little gnome-like man with an atrophied sense of curiosity. He raised his eyes and nodded when they entered, passing them a menu over a long counter. He scarcely seemed to notice their drenched and dripping clothes. The girl sat on a revolving stool facing her companion, her face still deathly pale, her eyes shining. "The fluorescence doesn't show in the light," she said. His hand went out and gripped her wrist. "I'll get you a job," he said, "tomorrow. A real job. You won't ever go out on that wharf again. Promise me you won't." "I promise," she said. "You might tell me your name." "Barbara Ellison," she said. "I am 23. I spent 4 years in a business college before I came east. I was born in the Middle West, but I came east to look for a job in an office. I didn't get one." "You'll have one tomorrow," he said. "Now, let's eat." Standing on the counter before them were 2 cups of coffee and a platter of doughnuts. The girl took one of the doughnuts and broke it apart with fingers that trembled a little. She said, "I'm grateful, believe me." "Nonsense," he said, feeling a little of the horror stealing over him again, feeling that she must never leave him. "I'm grateful to you. You'll never know how grateful." "But why? What did I do?" "You risked your life that belongs to so many people, and all for a girl with no courage at all." He said, "It takes courage to have too much to live for." Her face was very close now, and her breath fanned his cheek. In confusion, he picked up a doughnut and raised a steaming cup of coffee to his lips. "I'll take mine black," he said, and smiled at her when she pushed a pitcher of cream toward him. Then, suddenly, the smile vanished from his lips. The girl beside him was changing before his eyes. She was changing, receding into a nebulous haze. She seemed to be shrinking too, growing smaller, her limbs shortening, her face becoming plump and rosy. Horror blazed over him again. He turned as white as a sheet and began to tremble. The girl seemed to be still sipping her coffee, but her body was enveloped in a nebulous mist that swirled up about her in rippling waves. Her clothes were concealed by the white opacity. Obscurely, through the mist, he saw short, plump legs that dangled, and above them, the innocent face of a little child. She was a child of 4, a cherubic infant, sipping a cup of coffee almost as large as its face. Then, slowly, the mist evaporated, and the girl was beside him again. She was staring at him with troubled eyes. She said, "Why did you start so? You frightened me." Sweat beaded Marshall's forehead. He passed a hand across his damp brow, stared at the huge silver coffee percolator which stood at the end of the counter, and the proprietor dozing in shadows a few feet away. The proprietor was leaning over an oyster bar at the rear of the restaurant, his eyes 3/4 shut, his elbows supporting him as he drowsed. He had not changed at all. Neither had the coffee percolator, the long counter, the dingy plate-glass windows, and all the rest of the shabby little restaurant. Only the girl had changed, for a brief, appalling instant. White-lipped and trembling, Marshall picked up the checks. "Shall we go now, Barb? Barbara," he said. The girl glanced swiftly up at him. A strange tenderness came into her face. She said simply, "Yes, if you wish." He was trembling uncontrollably when they left the restaurant. As soon as they emerged into the street, she linked her arm in his and stared up into his white, tormented face, her eyes luminous with concern. "Are you ill, Thomas?" she asked. He shook his head and walked with her in silence through the chill grayness that precedes dawn. Their linked shadows danced grotesquely on dim-lit pavements and flickered over deserted tenement house doorways. Suddenly he said, "Where do you live, Barbara?" She mentioned a mean street on the north side of the city. Marshall was familiar with the north side. Relief surged up in him as he visualized long rows of shabby, genteel rooming houses. The neighborhood was desolate and down at heel, a dismal region of decaying brownstones dating back to the Mauve Decade, but it was not a slum. It was about a 15-minute walk to the girl's home. Marshall seized her hand and held it tightly while they threaded their way out of the waterfront maze into a region where the squalor was less oppressive. He did not speak again until they arrived at the high stoop of the rooming house. The flames which poured from him enveloped the girl without harming her, swirling up about her slender body in a golden blaze. She was clinging to him and shivering, her face illumined by the lambent glare. His fingers tightened on her. He said, "I'll phone you in the morning, Barbara. Promise me you'll go straight to bed." She said, "I promise, Thomas," but she did not move away from him. Instead, she moved closer to him. She moved tremulously closer until she was in his arms. He cried out in sudden wonder and strained her to him, all else forgotten. The horror of the enveloping glow, the strange confusion which had descended upon his faculties, all was forgotten, swallowed up in a blinding ecstasy such as he had never known. She was in his arms, and he was kissing her hair and lips and eyes. The bleak rooming house towered up behind them, unseen. He was only aware of her warm and clinging arms and the wild beating of his heart. When he released her, her eyes were glowing. She turned and ran swiftly up the stoop into a dim-lit vestibule. Stunned, tremulous, he watched her fumbling in her bag for a key. Suddenly, she turned and blew him a kiss. "Tomorrow," she called, and was gone. He stood for an instant, staring up at the shabby facade above him, scarcely seeing it, thinking only of the girl who had vanished. Suddenly, he felt a chill creeping over him. The dismal brownstone was becoming nebulous, was receding into mist. It was unmistakably dwindling, receding. All about it whirled a tenuous haze. Gradually, a new mass seemed to collect behind it, a smaller, more graceful mass that emerged obscurely from whiteness. Marshall was held transfixed. The impossible was happening before his eyes. A huge, substantial house was dissolving, and another taking its place. As he watched, the new dwelling assumed sharp and distinctive contours. Before him, on the deserted street, stood a 3-story house of Georgian brick with antique chimney pots and glowing square-paned windows. Silhouetted in its fan-lighted doorway was the figure of a young man with pale aristocratic features. The young man was startlingly attired in sky-blue smallclothes and snow-white periwig. Silver buckles gleamed on his satin pumps, and he wore silken breeches. As Marshall stared, there appeared beside him in the doorway a slender, white-haired girl, dressed in the costume of the 18th century. Marshall cried out in stunned wonder. The mist was returning again, was obscuring the outlines of the second dwelling. Gradually, it receded until it was a vague, amorphous blur. In the depths of the blur, an enormous shape was stirring. As the second dwelling dwindled, a gargantuan animal form loomed obscurely out of the mist. Gigantically, it towered in the still night, while on both sides of it, the air seemed to quiver and recede with a curious glimmering over silent houses of decaying brownstone. In the mist-filled void between the houses loomed the terrifying apparition of an enormous cat. It was like no cat Marshall had ever seen before. It was 15 feet in height, and it sat immobile on its haunches, menacingly regarding him. It was snarling, hissing at him, its eyes glowing balefully in the darkness. But it was not so much the appalling size of the animal, nor its menacing ferocity, that filled Marshall with blind, unreasoning terror. What sent him reeling back across the gutter, his mind a jumbled ferment of incredulity and horror, was the cat's long, curving tusks. Curving out from the creature's feral jaws were 2 enormous slivers of ivory that glowed dully in the darkness. Mercifully, the mist returned, obscuring the monstrous feline. But Marshall did not wait for the shape to vanish. He turned and reeled blindly along the street. He was still reeling when he woke David Rand at 3 a.m. He appeared at Rand's door, disheveled, wild-eyed, his face the color of tallow. David Rand was Marshall's only friend in the city. Calm and scientific was David Rand, eyes palely discerning behind steel-rimmed spectacles, hair close-cropped, long, sallow face impeccable in its poise and restraint. He was Marshall's counselor in boyhood, the confidant of his years of struggle, 10 years older than Marshall, but still on the pleasant side of 40. Biochemist, physicist, astronomer, dabbler in a dozen sciences, but a competent and gifted dabbler. He met Marshall in pajamas, his face showing surprise and concern, guided him into a spacious, book-lined study, and mixed him a whiskey and soda. 5 minutes later, Marshall was talking. He sat in an old-fashioned easy-chair, leaning forward a little, his eyes glowing feverishly. He stopped occasionally to puff on a cigarette. Occasionally, he sipped at the glass in his hand. Rand listened in silence to Marshall's incredible recital, nodding his head thoughtfully from time to time. Finally, Marshall ceased to talk. He sank back exhausted and stared at his listener in mute despair. Rand sat regarding him for an instant in silence, his fingers plucking at the gray frogs on his black silk pajamas. When he spoke, his pale eyes were glowing. There is much, of course, that we still do not understand about the strange new reality which we are accustomed to refer to as space-time. But this thought has occurred to me, Thomas. You ascended 53,000 miles. Cosmic rays and the rays of infralight are potent in the upper ionosphere. He stroked his chin thoughtfully. You are, of course, familiar with the speculations of that gifted biochemist, Dr. Krill. Krill believed that all our body cells are endowed with microscopic suns, radiogens, continually radiating microspecks of searing light. He believes that life itself is a byproduct of billions of tiny suns, which suck energy from light, of tiny suns that glow in us, microscopic batteries of life. He paused an instant, then resumed. Now consider the new mysterious space-time of the physicists, of Einstein, Eddington, de Sitter, and the rest. Our awareness of space-time is limited, because human perception is three-dimensional. We do not perceive time as an aspect of space, but we know that time is an aspect of space. If human perception were four-dimensional, we would not be aware of time as a flowing of events. We would not be aware of time at all. The past, the present, and perhaps the future would exist as static realities. We could examine one segment of space-time and see the past, another segment and see the present. I am not so sure about the future. But space-time would exist as a definite entity, timeless, static. All the past would exist in that entity, all the past, the present, and perhaps all the future. To express it differently, we would perceive space as it really is, and that includes time. Space-time is simply true of four-dimensional space. Time is simply an aspect of true space. We cannot perceive true space because our faculties are biologically limited. But suppose we intensified our life forces. Suppose we transcended our protoplasmic limitations. Assume that life is a byproduct of the tiny suns in us, the radiogens. Suppose those radiogens sucked new energy from the cosmic rays, expanded, became novas in our body cells. You understand, new suns, brighter suns. Marshall was leaning forward in his chair now, his face strangely taut. You mean, he said, that up in the ionosphere? Rand nodded. The cosmic rays charged your radiogens, which are microscopic batteries of life, with undreamed-of new energies. They flared more brightly in you, Thomas. That would explain the glow, the fierce exultation that swept over you, the desire to run and shout. Life burned more fiercely in you, Thomas. Your faculties expanded. You transcended your biological limitations. You perceived the fourth-dimensional or true space. Only momentarily, of course, in flickers, but you perceived the past, which still exists in true space. You had momentary evanescent glimpses of the past. You saw the girl you spoke of as a little child, and you— Wait a minute, Thomas. You did see the future. The future must exist. You saw the old woman shrivel and become a fleshless skeleton. Rand sprang up and strode about the room. You saw the future. Do you realize what that means, Thomas? The implications! Marshall did not reply. When Rand saw how pale Marshall had become, he sat down abruptly. It was chiefly the past you saw, he said, sporadically, in flashes. You saw an 18th century house. Then you went back across wide wastes of years. You saw a saber-toothed tiger, a Macarodus, the largest, most sinister cat that ever walked the earth. You went back to the dim Eocene, to the age of the asphalt pits. Marshall felt very weak, tired, soul-sick, and appalled. He said, But when Barbara became a little child, the restaurant did not recede or change, and when the house vanished, the street and the adjoining houses remained unchanged. And when Barbara was really a child, she was somewhere else in the world, not sitting beside me on a stool, yet I saw her sitting there. Rand said, You're assuming that relationships in space-time, or true space, are similar to relationships in our three-dimensional space. But it is an unlikely assumption. With the expression of your faculties of perception, all relationship would change. We can only speculate as to just how they would change. It is probably that human beings preserve a definite continuity in true space which transcends their orientation in our space. You saw the girl sitting beside you because her past in true space was not chained down to her actual position when she was really a child in our space. Remember that plants, animals, and human beings are complex examples of entropic inversion. Entropy, as you know, means dissolution, disintegration. The universe as a whole is running down, but organic life is not. Organic life is building up, swimming against the swift entropic currents. It is possible that living organisms maintain a certain integrity in true space that makes them independent of our space when you perceive them as space-time units. Suddenly, Rand stood up again. His eyes were glowing. "Thomas," he said, "you have no idea how I envy you. Never before, in the whole history of our race, has a man been so gloriously privileged. You are no longer a wretched earth-bound biped akin to the apes. You have become godlike in your perceptions." Marshall groaned. "I do not want to be godlike, Rand. I want to be a normal human being again, not enveloped in flames, with all the world unstable about me. Rand, what am I to do?" Rand's impassivity was completely gone now. He strode up and down the room, no longer able to control himself. Suddenly, he whirled on Marshall. "It is regrettable that the flames you spoke of are invisible in this light. I must see them. Thomas, I am going to turn out the light." Marshall leapt up in protest, but before he could reach Rand's side, the other had stepped to the wall and switched off all the illumination in the room. Utter darkness engulfed the two men. Rand could hear Marshall's agitated breathing, and Marshall was aware of Rand moving about close to the wall. But utter darkness engulfed them. There was no light at all in the room. Suddenly, the light was on again. Rand was staring at Marshall with set lips. He seemed shaken, disappointed. He said, "You are no longer enveloped in flames, Thomas." Marshall swayed a little. You think?" Rand nodded. "You are obviously normal again. You have had your wish. You have ceased to be godlike. Evidently, the radiogens flared with fierce new energies and then burned themselves out. Or rather, dwindled to normal tiny suns again." He was scowling disappointedly, as one who regretted to admit an unwelcome and unpleasant truth. "It is significant that you were not immediately luminous. Evidently, you were flooded with rays, drenched by your 10 hours high above Earth. It is probable that the radiogens absorbed the energy slowly, flared into brief novae, and then dwindled again to the smaller suns of normal protoplasm." The color crept back into Marshall's cheeks. He straightened, seemed to increase in height. He said, "Nothing has changed in this room. Nothing. The other changes occurred swiftly, at 15-minute intervals. For over an hour, there has been no change at all." Rand nodded. "I am quite sure you are normal again," he said. "You are restored. It is a pity, a great and tragic pity. For a brief hour, you were godlike. You could even see into the future and predict human events. You might have altered the destiny of our race." Marshall said, "I am godlike now. A man in love is very close to the eternal." "In love," said Rand. "I had forgotten. In love, Thomas." But Marshall did not hear him. He saw again moonlight haloing red-gold hair, dappling a white throat. He saw her face again, luminous with tenderness. He saw her standing in a dim-lit vestibule, waving at him. He heard her whisper, "Tomorrow, Thomas, tomorrow." Happiness enveloped him like a flame, swirling up about him in a golden blaze.